Duke Arthur Blackwell hadn't meant to linger. He'd only stepped in to retrieve a note he'd left tucked inside her Bible the week before. A small thing, a forgotten appointment. Nothing more. But when he lifted the book and turned it over, something slipped from between the pages. A lock of hair, golden, bright, almost luminous against his dark palm. He didn't move for a long moment. His own hair had long since gone silver. The kind of silver that comes not from age alone, but from years of carrying things no man should carry alone. And Catherine? His wife's hair was black as coal, thick, dark, unmistakable. That lock of hair belonged to neither of them. He turned it over in his fingers once, twice, and then, slowly, deliberately, he folded it and placed it in his breast pocket. He did not call for the servants. He did not go looking for Catherine. He did not slam a single door. That evening, he sat across from his wife at dinner as he always did. He listened to her talk about the roses in the garden, about a letter she'd received from her cousin, about the weather turning cold. He smiled when she smiled. He refilled her glass when it emptied. And the whole time, his hand rested just over his breast pocket, waiting. To understand what happened in that study on a quiet Sunday morning in 1885, you first need to understand the man standing in it. Arthur Blackwell was not simply a duke. He was the kind of man that rooms went silent for. Not because he demanded it, he never did, but because he carried authority the way some men carry grief. Quietly, completely, as though it had become part of his bones. It begins in 1867. Cold November morning. Arthur is 19 years old. His father, the 6th Duke of Blackwell, died before sunrise. No final words. No farewell. Just a servant knocking on his door, delivering a single sentence in a flat, practiced tone. Your Grace, your father has passed. Your Grace. Arthur stood in his doorway, barely 19, and felt the full weight of those 2 words land on his shoulders like something physical. He didn't cry. Blackwell men didn't cry. His father had made sure of that. George Blackwell was not a cruel man in the way villains in stories are cruel. He didn't shout. He didn't strike. He simply had a way of making you feel, at all times, that you were slightly less than what was required. When Arthur was 12, he came second in a riding competition. Second out of 40 boys. He rode home bursting with pride. His father's response was 4 words. Who came in first? By 15, Arthur had stopped bringing his father anything. Not victories, not questions, not feelings. He had learned to manage himself the same way his father managed the estates, efficiently, without sentiment, without waste. Effective way to run a dukedom. Very lonely way to be a human being. At 19, he inherited everything. 3 estates, thousands of acres, a seat in the House of Lords, a name that opened every door in the country, and not a single person in the world he could call a true friend. He was, by every measurable account, an exceptional duke. But his house was quiet. Then came Eleanor. Lady Eleanor Voss. She laughed too loudly, argued with bishops, left books open face down on every surface. She was, in short, chaos. And Arthur Blackwell fell in love with her so completely and so helplessly that it frightened him. For 3 years, he knew what happiness was. Not the grand theatrical kind, just the small daily kind. Waking up next to someone who was genuinely glad you existed. Then, in the winter of 1872, Eleanor became pregnant. The birth came early, long, brutal. Arthur waited in the corridor outside, and those hours were the longest of his life. A nurse came out. Eleanor had not survived. The baby, a boy, had not survived either. Arthur thanked her quietly, the way you thank someone for delivering any piece of information. He walked home through the London streets alone, in the dark in February, and somewhere between the hospital and his front door, he made a decision. not with words, but in the deep and wordless way that people make the decisions that shape the rest of their lives. He decided not to feel it. He decided to become marble. For 7 years he functioned. He managed. He fulfilled every obligation that came with his name. But the house was quiet again. And this time, Arthur had made sure there was nothing in it to disrupt that quiet. No laughter too loud, no books left face down, no humming, just efficiency. Just the cold, perfect machinery of a well-run life. That is the man who would pick up that lock of golden hair on a Sunday morning in 1885. A man built from loss, sealed shut by design, who had once known what it felt like to be loved, and had spent years convincing himself he was perfectly fine without it. Remember that? Because everything that follows depends on understanding exactly how much Arthur Blackwell had to lose, and how little he believed he deserved to keep it. Before we go any further, we need to talk about Catherine, because this story is not just Arthur's. Catherine Ashford was born in 1857. On paper, the Ashfords were a respectable family. Old name? Good bloodline. A modest estate in Wiltshire. And a father, charming, witty, the kind of man people were always genuinely glad to see walk into a room. What people didn't see was what happened after the dinner parties ended. Lord Ashford had a gift for many things. Financial management was not among them. For years, quietly, methodically, the way slow disasters always unfold, he made bad decision after bad decision. Bad investments, bad loans, bad pride mostly. The kind that keeps a man from admitting he needs help until it is far too late for help to matter. Catherine knew. She had known since she was 12 years old, creeping downstairs for a glass of water and finding her father at his desk at 3 in the morning, staring at a column of numbers with the expression of a man staring at his own grave. She never asked him about it. That was not how the Ashford household worked. You didn't ask. You observed. You adapted. You kept your face composed and your voice light, and you made sure that whatever was breaking on the inside never showed on the outside. Catherine became very, very good at that. In the spring of 1874, when Catherine was 17, her father died. The official cause was heart failure. Catherine was the one who found him. She closed the door. She sat on the floor of the hallway outside it for a long time, very still, staring at nothing. And then she stood up, straightened her dress, walked to the top of the stairs, and called for the housekeeper in a calm, clear voice. "Mrs. Peel, please send for the doctor. I'm afraid my father has had a heart attack." She protected him, even then, because the truth would have destroyed what little was left. She told no one, not ever. She carried it alone, quietly, completely, as though it had become part of her bones. Sound familiar? After her father's death, Catherine's world shrank fast. The estate was sold. Her mother faded into fragility. At 17, Catherine became the person who held everything together, managing money, maintaining appearances, keeping the Ashford name from sliding entirely into obscurity. By 22, she had looked directly at loss, shame, poverty, and isolation, and she had not looked away. She had not collapsed. She had not become bitter, though God knows she had every right to. She had simply kept going. She had become, without anyone noticing, formidable. It was November of 1879 when she met Arthur Blackwell, a music evening in London. Catherine sat down at the piano and played Schubert. And something about the way she played, no performance, no sideways glances at the audience, just complete and total honesty, made a closed-off Duke standing at the back of the room stay when he had been planning to leave. They were introduced briefly afterward. 2 sentences. then separated by the movement of the room. But on the carriage ride home, for the first time in years, Arthur Blackwell was not thinking about his estates. He proposed 6 weeks later, in his study. No flowers, no performance, just honesty. "I cannot promise you poetry," he said. "I cannot promise that I'll always know how to be what you need. I have been alone for a long time, and I am not entirely sure I remember how to be otherwise." He looked at her steadily. "But I can promise you respect. I will never diminish you. And I will make sure you and your mother never worry about money again." A long silence. "That is what I am offering. I understand completely if it isn't enough." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Was it relief she felt? The overwhelming physical relief of knowing the financial terror shadowing every day of her life would simply end? Was it something she'd felt watching this careful, closed-off man laugh for the first time at that dinner party? Was it calculation? Was it something softer than all of that? Something she wasn't ready to name yet? "It's enough," she said. They married in February of 1880, and Lady Catherine Blackwell moved into the most beautiful, most comfortable, most quietly lonely house she had ever seen. Here is what the world saw: a perfect match, a distinguished duke and his elegant young wife. Here is what no one saw: two people who had each become experts at surviving and had absolutely no idea how to do anything else together. But that's the thing about two people who have spent years carrying impossible weights alone. Sometimes, without meaning to, without even noticing, they start caring for each other. Marriage, as it turns out, is not a destination. It's a negotiation. A daily, largely unspoken negotiation between two people who have brought all of their history, all of their damage, all of their carefully constructed walls into the same house, and are now expected to build something new out of all of it. Arthur and Catherine were not good at this. Not at first. But they were trying. The first months were polite. Achingly, exhaustingly polite. Breakfast at 8. Arthur read the newspaper. Catherine read whatever was on her nightstand. They discussed the weather, estate matters, letters received. Unfailingly courteous. Never argued. Never raised their voices. Never said anything real. Arthur kept his distance, because distance, for him, had always been self-preservation. Catherine didn't push because she could feel, with the instincts of someone who had never been able to afford a misread situation, that this man was fragile in a way he would never, in 1,000 years, have called himself fragile. So she waited. It was the garden that started things. A walled garden on the east side of the manor. Old roses, overgrown hedges, a stone bench that hadn't been sat on in years. Catherine found it in March and started going every morning. By the 4th morning, Arthur appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and no very clear explanation for why. Catherine said nothing, just moved slightly to the left on the bench. Arthur sat down. They drank their coffee in silence, but it was a different silence from the breakfast table. Something more like companionship, tentative, unspoken, but real. After that, the garden became theirs. Small things built up. Catherine reorganized his library, diplomatically calling his system creative, and less diplomatically when she'd run out of diplomacy. Genuinely baffling. Arthur told her she was welcome to redo it however she liked. When she finished, he spent an afternoon quietly examining her system and finding, with a private irritation he would not have admitted to anyone, that it was considerably better than his own. He didn't tell her that, but he noticed that he wanted to. Catherine discovered that Arthur had a dry and devastating sense of humor that appeared without warning. He would say something so precisely, quietly funny that she would laugh before she'd even decided to. And he would look at her with startled satisfaction, as though her laugh was something he hadn't planned for, but was unexpectedly pleased by. She noticed she started saying slightly more ridiculous things than she meant, just to see if it would happen again. But the distance was always there, a ceiling they kept bumping against without ever naming it. And then there was the locked room. 3rd floor, east wing. Dark oak door like all the others. Except this one was always locked. When Catherine tried the handle one afternoon and found it immovable, something in her, that finely tuned awareness, made a quiet note of it. She asked the housekeeper, "Old storage, my lady. His Grace prefers it kept closed?" Technically sufficient. Emotionally completely insufficient. They both knew it. Catherine let it go. But she didn't forget it. Because in her experience, the things people locked away were never just old storage. They were the things people couldn't bear to look at directly, but couldn't bring themselves to release. She knew something about that. She found out about Eleanor 6 months into the marriage. Not from Arthur, from old Lady Pemberton over tea with the cheerful carelessness of someone who assumed Catherine already knew. Absolutely transformed the man. And then to lose her like that. And the baby too. She caught herself, looked at Catherine. "But I'm sure you know all of this, my dear." "Of course," Catherine said, smiled, lifted her teacup. On the carriage ride home, she sat very still and looked out the window and rearranged everything she thought she understood about her husband. She didn't confront him, she just paid attention. 5 years in, something had shifted. Not everything. The distance was still there. The locked room was still locked. Arthur still excused himself after dinner most evenings. But he laughed more. Real laughs, the kind that surprised him. He had started leaving his study door open. Once, only once, never mentioned again, he fell asleep in the drawing room chair. Catherine laid a blanket over him. He stirred, half asleep, and said without opening his eyes, "Catherine." Just her name. But the way he said it, like it was something he was glad of. Here is the thing about trust. It is not built in grand gestures or declarations. It is built in coffee cups on cold mornings, in lamp angles adjusted without looking up, in the sound of imperfect piano playing drifting through a house that used to be silent. Arthur and Catherine had spent 5 years building something. Carefully, imperfectly, without ever quite admitting they were doing it. And now, sitting in his breast pocket, was the one thing that could unmake all of it. The question was not whether he had found the hair. The question was what he was going to do next. October 1885. The manor was still. The kind of still that only happens on Sunday mornings. No carriages on the gravel, no servants rushing between rooms. Just the distant sound of wind moving through the old oak trees along the east wall, and the occasional creak of a house settling into its own silence. Arthur had been awake since 5, not unusually. He had not been sleeping well for weeks, a fact he had not mentioned to anyone, because mentioning it would have required explaining why, and he had no explanation he was willing to examine too closely. Just a restlessness. A low, persistent hum of something he couldn't name. He dressed without ringing for his valet, moved quietly through the corridor. Catherine's rooms were on the opposite end of the hall. He could see the thin line of darkness under her door. Still asleep. He went to his study first, sat at his desk, opened a letter from his solicitor that he'd been avoiding for 3 days, read the first paragraph twice without absorbing it, and then remembered the note. A small thing. A meeting with his land steward, rescheduled twice. He had written the new date on a slip of paper and tucked it, hastily, absently, the way you put things down when your mind is elsewhere, into the nearest book at hand, which had apparently been Catherine's Bible. He hadn't noticed until the following morning. And then he told himself he'd retrieve it later. And later had become a week. He crossed the corridor and opened the door to Catherine's study. Her room was different from his. His study was ordered, precise, everything in its place, nothing on the desk that didn't need to be there. Catherine's study was ordered too, but warmer. Books doubled up on shelves. A small vase of dried flowers on the windowsill. Letters stacked carefully, but with that particular quality of having been read more than once. Her Bible was on the small table beside her reading chair. Arthur picked it up, turned it over, began to flip through the pages looking for the slip of paper. It fell out before he found his note. One moment it wasn't there. The next it was drifting, slow and weightless, down toward the floor. He caught it. He stood very still. A lock of hair. Golden. Not the dull, flat gold of aging, but bright, almost luminous. Young hair, tied loosely with a thin piece of ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to almost nothing. He turned it over in his fingers. His own hair had long since gone silver. Catherine's was black as coal, thick and dark. Never anything other than black as long as he'd known her. This hair belonged to neither of them. He stood in his wife's study in the early morning light and looked at what he was holding. And the thing that would stay with him, the thing that would come back to him in the sleepless nights that followed, was not the jolt of it, not the sharp, nauseating lurch of suspicion. It was the ribbon, the care with which it had been tied. The way the hair had been folded and preserved between the pages of her Bible, of all books, her Bible, the one her mother had given her, the one she had carried from the Ashford house through everything, the one he had seen her hold on the nights when she thought no one was watching. You don't keep something like that, unless it matters to you enormously. He could have called for her, could have walked down the corridor and knocked on her door and held it up and asked, simply, directly, "Whose is this?" He didn't. He folded the hair carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, found his note. It had been 2 pages further along, and tucked it into his coat. Then he left the room, exactly as he had found it, and went back to his study. At 8 o'clock, breakfast was served. Catherine came down in her morning dress, hair pinned loosely, still waking up. She poured her tea, asked about his plans for the day, mentioned a letter she'd received from her cousin in Bristol. Something funny her cousin's youngest had done. She couldn't remember exactly, but it had made her laugh. Arthur listened. He asked a question about the cousin, said something that made Catherine smile, drank his coffee, and the whole time his hand rested just over his breast pocket, just over that small, folded weight. Waiting. He could not have told you, if asked, what exactly he was waiting for. He was not by nature an impulsive man. He did not make decisions without information. He did not act on feeling alone, or at least he had spent 20 years building a version of himself that didn't. But there was something else too, something quieter and more complicated than strategy. He was waiting because some part of him, the part that had learned, across 5 careful years, to sit beside her on a cold bench with 2 cups of coffee, was not yet ready to know. And that, perhaps, was the most frightening thing of all. There is a particular kind of torture that has no name. It is not the torture of knowing. Knowing, at least, gives you something solid to stand on, something to push against, to grieve, to rage at. This was the torture of not knowing, of looking at someone you have spent 5 years learning to trust and suddenly seeing everything through a different a different lens, of replaying every small moment and asking, was that real? Was any of it real? Arthur Blackwell spent the following 2 weeks living inside that torture. And he did it, as he did everything, in complete silence. He began to watch. Not obviously. Not in the way that betrays itself. No sudden questions, no changed routines, no coldness that Catherine might notice and question. He simply became more attentive, more precise, filing away details he would previously have let pass unexamined. Catherine left the house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She always had. Social visits, she called them. He had never asked for specifics. Now he found himself, for the first time, wanting them. He didn't ask. He listened instead. To the servants. To the small fragments of information that move through a household like water through cracks. Not gossip exactly. Just the natural accumulation of details that staff carry without realizing they're carrying them. What he heard unsettled him. The Tuesday visits. No one seemed entirely sure where she went. The carriage was taken. She returned within 2 hours, always alone. And then there was Captain James Whitmore. He had arrived in the county 6 weeks earlier, young, cavalry background, posted temporarily to a regiment near the village. Broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having had a real reason to doubt yourself. And golden-haired. Arthur had met him at a dinner in September, 3 weeks before finding the lock of hair. He had shaken his hand and thought nothing of it. Now he turned the memory over with different hands entirely. He remembered that Catherine had been seated near Whitmore at that dinner. He remembered that they had talked. He remembered, and this was the one that found the gap between his ribs and stayed there, that she had laughed at something Whitmore said. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind he had spent 5 years earning from her one careful joke at a time. He told himself he was being rational, that he was simply gathering information. He was not being rational. 2 weeks after finding the hair at a reception at Lord Harcastle's estate, he watched them. Whitmore approached Catherine near the fireplace. They spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. Nothing remarkable, the body language of 2 people making polite conversation, nothing more. But Catherine's back was to Arthur. She didn't know he was watching. And at one point, just once, Whitmore leaned in slightly, lowered his voice, said something Arthur couldn't hear. Catherine glanced around the room, not at Arthur specifically, just checking. The way you check when you're saying something you'd rather wasn't overheard. Then she nodded. Arthur looked away. He spoke to Lord Harcastle for 20 minutes about drainage systems on the northern estates. He was, by all accounts, completely present in that conversation. Inside his breast pocket, his fingers found the folded lock of hair. He thought about Eleanor, about those 3 years when the house wasn't quiet, about what it had cost him when that ended. He thought about the garden bench, the library, the blanket laid over him in the firelight. He thought, I cannot survive this twice. And then he thought, I need more information. He also thought about his nephew, Edward Blackwell, 28, charming in the way that costs nothing and means nothing. He had always circled Catherine with a particular attention that Arthur had noticed and dismissed. Edward was a man who circled everyone. It meant very little. Now Arthur found himself reassessing. Edward had been at the house twice in the past month. Both times he had sought out Catherine's company with a persistence that, viewed through the new lens, looked less like ordinary sociability and considerably more like something else. On his second visit, Arthur had come around the corner of the library to find them standing close together near the window. Edward speaking in a low voice, Catherine with her arms crossed and her expression closed. When she saw Arthur, something in her face shifted. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. "Edward was just leaving," she said. Edward smiled. "Indeed. Always a pleasure, Uncle." Arthur had watched him go and said nothing. But that closed expression on Catherine's face, that something complicated. He turned it over for days afterward, trying to decide what it meant. He could not. Jealousy is a quiet poison. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with trumpets and accusations. It just settles in, gets into the water supply. And then everything you look at has a slightly different taste, and you can't remember anymore what anything tasted like before. Arthur Blackwell was a methodical man, a fair man. A man who had always, in every arena of his life, demanded evidence before reaching conclusions. But he was also a man who had been alone for a very long time before a Catherine. And the heart, it turns out, does not always wait for evidence. It was a Thursday, 2 a.m. The manor completely dark, completely still. Arthur had not gone to bed. He had sat in his study with a glass of brandy he hadn't touched, and a book he hadn't read, and the particular company of a man who is trying very hard not to think about the one thing he cannot stop thinking about. He heard the sound at 2:30, soft, careful, the sound of someone who does not want to be heard. He crossed to his window. Below, in the faint moonlight, a figure moved along the side of the house toward the back gardens. Dark pelerine, hood up, but the walk, that particular straightness of spine, that particular quality of movement. Catherine. He followed. Not immediately. He gave her a head start, enough that she wouldn't hear him behind her. And then he moved through the dark house and out through the side door and into the cold night air. She was crossing the rear lawn toward the stables. He stopped at the edge of the garden wall. The stable door opened. She slipped inside, and from where Arthur stood, in the dark, in the cold, he could hear, faintly through the thick stable walls, the sound of voices. Low. A conversation. And then, unmistakably, the sound of someone crying. He stood there for a long time. The cold worked its way through his coat. An owl moved somewhere in the oak trees along the wall. The voices inside were too muffled to make out words. Just tone, just the shape of an exchange that was clearly weighted with something. He took 3 steps toward the stable door and stopped. He stood there with his hand not quite raised toward the latch. And then he turned around and walked back to the house. Why? He asked himself that question for the rest of the night, sitting back in his study, brandy still untouched. Why didn't he open the door? The answer that came most easily was the dignified one, that a duke does not lurk outside stable doors in the middle of the night like a jealous tradesman. That he would confront this in his own way, in his own time, with evidence rather than instinct. That answer was not entirely false. But it was not entirely true either. The truer answer, the one he circled and wouldn't quite land on, was simpler and considerably less dignified. He was afraid of what he would find. The next morning, Catherine came down to breakfast, looking tired. She poured her tea, mentioned that she hadn't slept well. The wind, she thought. Something in the eaves. Arthur looked at her across the table. "You should rest today," he said. "I'm fine," she said, smiled at him, reached for the toast. And he watched her hands, those steady, composed hands that never gave anything away, and thought about the sound of crying drifting through stable walls in the middle of the night. He said nothing. That afternoon he went to his solicitor. Not about the estates, not about legal matters. He asked quietly about the process for amending a will. There are men who, when faced with the possibility of loss, fight. They confront, they demand, they make noise. And then there are men like Arthur Blackwell. Men who have survived loss before by going very still, very quiet, very cold. Men who start, without fully realizing it, to prepare. He was not giving up on Catherine. He was doing something more dangerous than that. He was protecting himself. And the saddest thing about that, the thing that would come back to him later with full force, was that Catherine, in her own way, had spent years doing exactly the same thing. Two people, building walls against each other, out of the same fear, with the same hands. 3 days after the night visit, Arthur went to London. He told Catherine it was estate business. It was not entirely a lie. He did meet with his solicitor that morning, signed 3 documents, made 2 amendments to his will with the quiet efficiency of a man who has decided that preparation is the only thing he can control. Then he walked to Garrard's. Garrard's on Regent Street, the finest jewelers in England. The kind of establishment where the carpets are thick enough to swallow sound, and the staff have perfected the particular expression pass of respectful discretion that says, "Whatever you are here for, we will not ask questions." Arthur had been here before. Anniversary gifts mostly. Careful, appropriate choices. Things a duke gave his duchess because it was expected. This was different. He asked to see the necklaces. The assistant brought 3 trays. Arthur looked at them with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. And then, on the 3rd tray, in the corner, almost understated against the more dramatic pieces beside it, he saw it. A single oval sapphire, deep blue, set in a fine chain of white gold. Simple, extraordinary. He had seen Catherine look at it once, 6 months ago, at a jeweler's in Bath. She had picked it up, held it for a moment, set it down. "Too much," she had said quietly. Not to him, to herself. He had said nothing at the time, filed it away without quite knowing why. He bought it without asking the price. On the carriage ride home, he sat with the small velvet box in his coat pocket and tried to understand what he was doing. He was not a man who acted without understanding his own motivations. That had always been, he felt, one of his more reliable qualities. But this, he could not entirely explain this. Was it guilt? Preemptive guilt, perhaps, for the accusations he had not yet made but was building toward? Was it something more complicated? A last gesture toward the version of their marriage he had been, quietly and without announcement, beginning to believe in? Or was it simply the act of a man who, faced with the possibility of losing something, suddenly understands for the first time exactly what it is worth? He didn't know. He sat with the box in his pocket and watched the English countryside pass outside his window, and did not come to any conclusions. That evening at dinner, he waited until the plates had been cleared. Then he reached into his coat and placed the velvet box on the table between them. Catherine looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "Open it." She did, and something moved across her face. Not the polished gratitude of a woman receiving an expected gift, but something unguarded and brief and real. A flicker of something that looked almost like pain, before it resolved into wonder. "Arthur." Her voice was quiet. "This is... why?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because you deserve it," he said. She looked back down at the necklace. Her finger traced the edge of the sapphire very lightly. "Will you?" she started. Stopped. She lifted the necklace from the box and held it out to him. He stood, moved around the table, took it from her. His fingers worked the clasp at the back of her neck. The dark hair pinned up, the nape of her neck pale in the candlelight. And when it was fastened, she reached up and touched it once. Then she turned to look at him. And there it was, again. That thing he had been trying to name for 5 years. In her eyes, in the candlelight, steady and searching, and entirely unguarded. He held her gaze. In his breast pocket, 3 inches from his heart, sat a lock of golden hair. Later that night, alone in his study, Arthur sat for a long time in the dark. Not thinking, exactly. Just sitting with it. With the weight of the evening. He had given his wife diamonds while carrying the one thing that could shatter everything. And the worst part, the part that kept him in that chair until the fire went to embers, was that it had not felt like deception. It had felt like the truest thing he had done in years, which meant one of 2 things. Either he was a fool, or he was a man who was beginning, slowly and against his better judgment, to believe that the woman sitting across that dinner table deserved the benefit of the doubt. He didn't know which one frightened him more. Arthur Blackwell had always believed that the most dangerous thing a man could do was make a decision based on incomplete information. He had watched his father do it, had watched him move through the world with the absolute confidence of a man who confused certainty with truth, who made pronouncements, closed doors, ended conversations, all without ever fully understanding what he was pronouncing on. Arthur had spent his entire adult life doing the opposite. And so, 10 days after the night visit, 12 days after the diamonds, 23 days after finding the hair, he decided it was time to stop watching and start knowing. He began with the hair itself. He had a doctor, not the family physician, someone else. A quiet, discreet man in London he had used twice before for matters that required discretion. He rode to London on a Wednesday, told no one where he was going, and sat in a narrow Harley Street office while the doctor examined the lock of hair under a glass. The assessment took 10 minutes. Young, the doctor said. Very young. 15, perhaps 16. 17 at the outside. He looked up. Certainly not a grown woman's hair. And certainly not, a careful pause, a man's. Arthur rode home. A child. The hair belonged to a child. He sat with that for 2 days, turning it over, because it changed the shape of everything, not resolved it, not explained it, but changed it. The architecture of his suspicion had been built around a particular story, a particular kind of betrayal. This did not fit that story. So what story did it fit? He went to the records room. His own records, the Blackwell Estate Archives, kept in a locked room off the main library. Births, deaths, marriages going back 4 generations, legal documents, correspondence, financial records. He was looking for something he didn't fully know how to name yet. He started with 1872, Eleanor's death. The baby. He had not looked at these documents in 13 years. He opened the folder with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided that whatever is in here, he will not look away from it. Eleanor's death certificate, signed by Dr. Percival Hume. Cause of death, complications following childbirth. The baby's death certificate, also signed by Dr. Percival Hume. Cause of death, born weak, survived 3 days. Arthur stared at that second certificate for a long time. 3 days. He had been told the baby had not survived the birth. He had been told this by his father, standing in a corridor, while Arthur was still numb from losing Eleanor. He had never thought to question it. Why would he? What kind of man would lie about? He looked at the signature again. Dr. Percival Hume, his father's personal physician. Dead himself now, 12 years ago. He kept digging. Estate correspondence from 1872. Letters between his father and the solicitor, between his father and various household staff, most of it routine. And then, tucked between two unrelated documents about tenant leases, a letter. Short, unsigned. But in his father's handwriting. The arrangement has been made. The boy is placed with a family in the village of Cawton, North Yorkshire. The woman has been paid and understands the terms. This matter is closed. The date was March 1872, 3 weeks after Eleanor's death. Arthur read it twice. Then he set it down on the table, very carefully, as though it were something that might break. The boy, not the body, not the remains, the boy, is placed, present tense, active, living. He sat in that records room for a very long time. Outside, the autumn light moved slowly across the floor. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 4, then 5. He thought about his father. About those 4 words. Who came in first? About the man who had looked at a 19-year-old boy in a doorway and handed him the word, "Your Grace," like a weight rather than a gift. A man who had looked at a newborn, his own grandson, and decided that the inconvenience of his existence outweighed his right to live in the open. A man who had let his son grieve a child that was not dead. He thought about Catherine. The Tuesday visits, the Thursday visits. The stable, in the dark, at 2 in the morning. The voices. The crying. The lock of golden hair. Preserved in the pages of a Bible, like something sacred. Something shifted. Slowly, the way tectonic things shift. Not all at once, but with a particular irreversibility of things that cannot be undone once they've started moving. He needed one more thing. He needed a name. He needed to find Mrs. Hargrove. There is a specific kind of shame that has no adequate description. Not the shame of having done something wrong. The shame of having been wrong. About someone who deserved better from you. Arthur Blackwell had built a case. Methodically, carefully, with the full force of his considerable intelligence. He had built it against the wrong person. He didn't know that yet. Not completely. Not with certainty. But sitting in that records room, with his father's letter in his hand, he was beginning, with the same methodical honesty he brought to everything, to suspect it. Cawton was a village in North Yorkshire that existed, as far as the rest of England was concerned. Not at all. No railway stop. No coaching inn of note. Just a cluster of stone houses on a hillside, a church with a leaning spire, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to places that have never been asked to be anything other than what they are. Arthur rode the last 4 miles alone, having sent his carriage ahead to the nearest town. He did not want to arrive as a duke. He wanted to arrive as a man who needed information. And in his experience, dukes made people careful, and careful people told you very little. He found the house from the description in the estate correspondence. Small, well kept. A garden that someone tended with genuine attention. He knocked. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 70. White-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of face that had once been handsome and had aged into something better, something with more character, more weather in it. She looked at him, and her face went absolutely still. "I knew," she said quietly, "that one of you would come eventually." She stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in." Her name was Margaret Hargrove. She had been Eleanor's head nurse, hired for the pregnancy, present at the birth, present for everything that followed. She told it without preamble, without drama, as though she had rehearsed it many times in the privacy of her own conscience and had long since run out of ways to soften it. The baby had been born small but alive. Eleanor had held him once, briefly, before she lost consciousness for the last time. The baby's name, Eleanor had said in that brief window, was to be William. 2 days later, Eleanor was dead. And George Blackwell, the 6th Duke, Arthur's father, had arrived from London within hours. He had gone directly to the room where the infant was being nursed. He had spoken to the doctor, Percival Hume, privately, for perhaps 20 minutes. And then Dr. Hume had come to Mrs. Hargrove with instructions. The child was to be placed. Quietly. A family had been identified. Decent people in Yorkshire. The boy would be cared for, provided for, financially, through a blind arrangement. He would never know his origins, and the death certificate would reflect that he had not survived. I refused, Mrs. Hargrove said. At first. She looked at her hands. His Grace, your father, was not a man who accepted refusal. He made the consequences of my continued refusal very clear. I had a daughter, a grandson. She stopped. I have lived with it every day since. Arthur sat across from her in a small, quiet room, while the Yorkshire afternoon went gray outside the window. The family, he said, the one he was placed with. The Hartleys. Good people. They had no children of their own. And the boy? Mrs. Hargrove looked at him carefully. He's not a boy anymore. He'll be 17 in December. A pause. He's here, in Cawton. He's been here his whole life. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Does he know? No. The Hartleys raised him as their own. He knows nothing of his origins. Another pause. But someone else came, Arthur said. It was not a question. Mrs. Hargrove met his eyes. About 3 years ago, a woman, dark-haired, she said she was a distant relation of your late wife, doing genealogical research. Very composed, very careful with her questions. She paused. I recognized what she was really asking within about 10 minutes. And you told her? I told her, Mrs. Hargrove said simply. Because she deserved to know. And because... She looked at him steadily. I thought perhaps she might do what I hadn't been able to. Arthur rode back through the Yorkshire dark. The wind came off the moors, cold and direct, the way Yorkshire wind always does. No apology, no softening. He let it hit him. He thought about Catherine, 3 years ago, 2 years into their marriage, making a quiet journey to Yorkshire, asking careful questions, putting together the pieces of a puzzle that Arthur hadn't even known existed. Finding a boy. And then saying nothing. Not to him. Not to anyone. Carrying it. Alone, the way she carried everything. He thought about the locked room on the 3rd floor. He thought about the stable at 2 in the morning. He thought about the Bible. The hair. And it came apart, finally, the whole constructed architecture of his suspicion, that careful, methodical case he had built stone by stone over weeks. It came apart not dramatically, not all at once, but with a quiet, devastating completeness, like a house that has been undermined at the foundations. He had watched her. He had followed her through the dark. He had amended his will. He had looked at the woman who had spent 3 years quietly, secretly protecting everything he hadn't known he'd lost. And he had wondered if she was betraying him. There is a specific kind of reckoning that arrives not with anger, but with something much quieter, much harder to bear. Arthur Blackwell rode through the Yorkshire dark and felt it settle over him like the cold. He had been wrong. Not just wrong. He had been looking directly at an act of extraordinary love, and he had mistaken it for its opposite. He arrived back at the manor past midnight. The house was dark except for a single light. His study window, ground floor, facing the drive. He saw it from the gate, and something in him went very still. Catherine was awake. He came through the front door quietly, handed his coat to the night footman, stood for a moment in the entrance hall, looking at the strip of light under his study door. He could go upstairs, leave this until morning, when he had slept and ordered his thoughts, and could approach it with the composure that a conversation like this required. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he walked to the study door and opened it. Catherine was sitting in the chair by the fire. Not reading, not writing. Just sitting, hands folded in her lap, in the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and has made their peace with the waiting. She looked up when he came in. She looked not guilty, not frightened, just tired, in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. They looked at each other across the room. Arthur closed the door behind him. He didn't speak immediately. He crossed to the fireplace, stood with his back to it, looked at her. She held his gaze. And in that silence, that long, loaded, fire-lit silence, something passed between them that was more honest than anything they had said to each other in 5 years of careful, managed conversation. She knew where he had been. He knew that she knew. "How long?" he said finally. His voice was steady. He had made sure of that on the road home. "How long have you known?" Catherine looked at the fire for a moment. 3 years, she said. "Almost exactly. You went to Yorkshire?" "Yes." "You found Mrs. Hargrove?" "Yes." A pause. "And then you found him." She looked back at him. Yes. He absorbed that. 3 years. She had been carrying this for 3 years, sitting across from him at breakfast, walking with him in the garden, laying a blanket over him in the firelight, carrying this the entire time. "Why?" he said, and then stopped, because the question had too many possible endings, and he wasn't sure which one he needed answered first. Catherine seemed to understand that. "Because," she said quietly, "I didn't know what your father had told you. I didn't know if you knew and had chosen to leave him there. I didn't know if you knew and couldn't face it. I didn't know anything except that there was a 16-year-old boy in Yorkshire who was your son and who had no idea who he was." She paused. "And I knew that if I came to you with it directly, and I had misread the situation, if you knew, if you had reasons I didn't understand, I could destroy everything. For you, for him, for—" She stopped. "For us," Arthur said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He moved away from the fireplace, sat down in the chair across from her. The same 2 chairs they had occupied on 100 evenings. His book, her book, the fire between them. "The Tuesday visits," he said. "I go to see him. Through an intermediary. He doesn't know who I am. I arranged for him to have access to books, to a decent tutor. Last winter when he was ill, She paused. "I made sure he had a good doctor. The night in the stable." Something moved across her face. "He came to the village. He'd had a disagreement with the Hartleys. Nothing serious, just he's 17 and he's proud and he had nowhere to go. The intermediary contacted me. I went. You comforted him." "He doesn't know who I am," she said again. "He thinks I'm a friend of the family. Someone who helped the Hartleys once." She looked down at her hands. "He's very like you," she said quietly. in ways that have nothing to do with the hair. Arthur was silent for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, wind moved through the oaks. He reached into his breast pocket. He unfolded the lock of golden hair and held it in his open palm between them. Catherine looked at it, then at him. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes, something she had been holding for 3 years, shifted. "The Bible," he said. "His hair. From the first time I met him." Her voice was very quiet. "I know it was foolish to keep it where—" "No," Arthur said. She stopped. He looked at the hair in his palm for a moment. Then he looked at her. "It wasn't foolish," he said. "It was—" He stopped, because he did not, in that moment, have words adequate to what it was. Here is what Arthur Blackwell understood, sitting in his study at 1 a.m. with a lock of his son's hair in his hand. He had spent 23 years grieving a child who was alive. He had spent 5 years living beside a woman who had found that child, protected that child, and said nothing. Not out of deception, but out of a care so careful and so complete that it had looked, to a man who had forgotten what being cared for felt like, exactly like its opposite. He had been wrong. He had been so profoundly, completely wrong. And she had never once in all of it, asked for anything in return. He closed his fingers around the hair. "There is a ball," he said. "The Blackwell annual ball, 3 weeks from Saturday." Catherine looked at him, uncertain where this was going. "I would like," Arthur said, "for certain things to be said, publicly, things that are long overdue." He looked at her. "And I would like you to trust me with the rest." A long silence. Catherine, who had spent her entire life trusting only herself, because trusting anyone else had always been a luxury she couldn't afford, looked at this man across the fireplace. This careful, closed, marble man who had just ridden through the Yorkshire dark and come home, and sat across from her and said, "Trust me." "All right," she said. 2 people. Both of them experts at carrying impossible things alone. Both of them, in this moment, putting something down. 3 weeks. In the social calendar of English aristocracy, 3 weeks is nothing. A blink. Barely enough time to have invitations printed and returned. In the interior calendar of Arthur Blackwell, 3 weeks was an eternity. The preparations for the annual Blackwell ball proceeded as they always did. Mrs. Harrington moving through the house with her lists. The kitchens becoming a separate and sovereign nation, governed entirely by the cook. Flowers arriving from London, extra staff hired from the village. Catherine managed it all with her usual composure. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. They did not speak again about Yorkshire. Not directly, not yet. There was, by unspoken agreement, a kind of moratorium, as though both of them understood that the full weight of what had been revealed needed time to settle before it could be properly examined. But something had shifted in the texture of their days. Small things, again. Always small things with them. Arthur stopped excusing himself after dinner. Not dramatically. No announcement, no changed routine. He simply stopped leaving. He stayed by the fire. He read. Catherine read across from him. The silence between them was the same silence it had always been on those evenings, except that it wasn't, and they both knew it. One evening, Catherine looked up from her book and found him watching her. Not with the measuring, careful attention of the past weeks. Something different. Something that had put down its armor. She held his gaze for a moment, then went back to her book. But she was not reading, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. Edward Blackwell arrived 4 days before the ball. Uninvited, or rather invited by the standing assumption that family attended the annual ball, an assumption Arthur had never previously thought to revise. He arrived with luggage for a week and the easy confidence of a man who has never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. Arthur received him in the entrance hall. "Uncle." Edward, broad smile, hand extended. "Magnificent as always. The old place looks well." "Edward," Arthur shook his hand. "You're staying until the ball? If that suits." "Of course," Arthur said, and smiled. It was the smile of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and is, in the privacy of his own chest, entirely at peace with it. Edward, who was not a stupid man, felt something in that smile that he could not quite identify. Something that made him, very briefly, less certain of his footing. He dismissed it. He was good at dismissing things. Captain Whitmore received his invitation to the ball by post, as all local guests did. He accepted, as Arthur had known he would. Arthur had also, in the preceding 3 weeks, made certain quiet inquiries about Whitmore, through the same discreet channels he used for everything. What he found was not what he expected. Whitmore had served in India for 4 years, decorated twice. He had a younger sister, the family's pride, who had died 3 years ago at 16 after a long illness. He was, by every account, a man of genuine character who had no known connection to the Blackwell family beyond the dinner where they had met. A man who had perhaps simply been kind to a woman at a dinner party. A woman who was, Arthur now understood, carrying an enormous secret alone, and had perhaps simply been grateful for an uncomplicated conversation. Arthur folded the report and put it in the fire. The night before the ball, Arthur went to the locked room. He stood outside it for a moment with the key in his hand, a key he had not used in 13 years, kept at the bottom of a drawer in his study under things he never moved. He unlocked the door and went in. It was Eleanor's sitting room. He had sealed it the month after she died and had not opened it since. Everything exactly as it had been. Her writing desk, her books, the small portrait of her mother on the wall, a vase that had once held flowers and now held nothing. 13 years of undisturbed dust. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. He had kept this room locked because he could not bear to clear it and could not bear to enter it. Because grief for a man like Arthur Blackwell had never been something that moved through and passed. It had been something that had to be contained, managed, kept behind a locked door so that it didn't leak into the functional, efficient life he had constructed around it. He crossed to her writing desk. In the top drawer, he had not thought about this in years, had in fact forgotten it was there until he walked in and remembered, was a small journal. Eleanor's, the last one. He didn't open it. He simply held it for a moment, and then he placed it carefully on the desk in the open, where it could be seen. He was not ready to read it. He might not be ready for a long time, but he was done keeping it locked away. He looked around the room one more time. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask Mrs. Harrington to open the windows. He found Catherine in the corridor outside, on her way back from the east sitting room. They nearly collided at the corner. She looked at the open door behind him, at the key in his hand. She said nothing. Her face said everything. Arthur looked at her for a moment. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "after the ball, there are things I want to show you. Things I should have shown you a long time ago." Catherine looked at the open door one more time, then back at him. "All right," she said. "Here is what no one in that house knew. Not the servants, not Edward, not the guests who would arrive tomorrow in their carriages and their finest clothes. The Blackwell Annual Ball had been, for 20 years, a performance. A display of everything the dukedom represented, its wealth, its history, its impeccable surface. Tomorrow it was going to be something else entirely. Tomorrow, for the first time in a very long time, something true was going to happen in this house, in front of everyone. The night of the Blackwell Annual Ball was everything it was supposed to be. Carriages lined the drive from 8 o'clock. The great hall blazed with candlelight, hundreds of them reflected in the mirrors, in the crystal glasses, in the jewels that the women of English aristocracy wore like armor. The orchestra was imported from London. The flowers were white and gold. It was, by every observable measure, perfect. And underneath that perfection, running like a current through the whole evening, was something else. Something that the more perceptive guests could feel without being able to name, a quality of tension, of things held in suspension, of the particular atmosphere that precedes not a storm exactly, but a reckoning. Catherine came downstairs at 8:30. The blue sapphire at her throat, her black hair pinned up with a simplicity that made every more elaborate coiffure in the room look effortful by comparison. Her face composed, as always, that perfect, practiced composure that had carried her through everything. Arthur was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at her, and something in his face, brief, unguarded, gone before anyone else could have caught it, made Catherine's step slow for just a moment on the last stair. He offered his arm. She took it. The evening moved as these evenings always move. In currents and eddies, conversations begun and abandoned, alliances assessed and allegiances noted. The orchestra played. The champagne circulated. The machinery of English social performance turned with its usual relentless efficiency. Edward was in excellent spirits. He had been working the room for an hour by the time Catherine arrived. Charming the older women, flattering the younger ones. Saying the right things to the right men, with the practiced ease of someone who has always understood that likability is its own kind of currency. He found Catherine near the fireplace at 9 and leaned in with a smile that was several degrees warmer than was appropriate. "You look extraordinary tonight, Catherine." "Thank you, Edward." Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes were not. "I've been meaning to speak to you, privately, about— I don't think that will be necessary," she said. Something in her tone made him pause. "No?" "No," she said, and turned to greet another guest, leaving Edward standing at the fireplace with his champagne and the unfamiliar sensation of having been dismissed. Captain Whitmore arrived at 9:30. He found Arthur within minutes, came to him directly, which Arthur noted with a handshake and a straightforward expression that contained neither guilt nor deflection. "Your Grace, thank you for the invitation." "Captain," Arthur looked at him steadily, "I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. In Yorkshire." Something shifted in Whitmore's face. Careful, assessing. "I may know who you mean," he said. "You've been helpful," Arthur said. "More than you know, more than I knew, until recently." A pause. Whitmore looked at him, then nodded, a small, precise nod that contained more than it appeared to. "He's a good lad," Whitmore said quietly. "I know," Arthur said. "I intend to make sure he knows it too." At 10 o'clock, Arthur set down his glass. He moved through the room quietly, the way he moved through everything, without announcement, without drama. He said something brief to the orchestra. The music slowed, stopped. The room noticed. Conversations tapered. Heads turned. Arthur stood at the center of the great hall. 200 people, the cream of English aristocracy. Every eye in the room on him, some curious, some wary, some already scenting something in the air and leaning in. Edward, across the room, straightened slightly. Catherine, near the east wall, went very still. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said. His voice carried without effort. That was the thing about Arthur Blackwell. He never needed to raise it. "Most of you have attended this ball for many years. Some of you knew my father. Many of you have known me for most of my adult life." A pause. "You have also, I understand, known something of my wife's reputation of late?" The room went very quiet. Someone coughed. Edward's champagne glass tilted slightly in his hand. Arthur reached into his breast pocket. He removed the folded lock of golden hair and held it up, not theatrically, not for effect, just simply so that the people nearest him could see it. "This was found in my wife's Bible, a lock of golden hair. I am told that several of you are aware of this." He looked around the room. "You drew your own conclusions. I understand. I drew mine as well." He paused. "I was wrong." Absolute silence. 17 years ago, my father made a decision. He decided that my son, my firstborn child, born of my late wife Eleanor, was better off dead in the official records than alive in the world. He arranged for the boy to be placed with a family in Yorkshire. He paid for the silence of everyone involved. And he told me my child had not survived. The silence in the room had a different quality now, denser, heavier. I did not know. I want to be entirely clear about that. I did not know. He turned. Catherine was looking at him from across the room. Her face, for once, for the first time perhaps in her adult life, was not composed. Her eyes were bright. Her hands were still. 3 years ago, Arthur said, my wife discovered what my father had done. She made a quiet journey to Yorkshire. She found the woman who had been present at my son's birth. She found the family he had been placed with. She found him. He held Catherine's gaze. And then she spent 3 years making sure he was safe, educated, cared for, without telling me. Not out of deception, out of a care so complete and so careful that she was willing to carry it entirely alone, rather than risk doing it wrong. A pause. The hair in the Bible belonged to my son. She kept it the way you keep what is most precious to you. He was still looking at her. Catherine Blackwell did not betray me. She protected everything I didn't know I had lost. He crossed the room. The crowd parted, not consciously, just the instinctive movement of people making way for something they recognize without being able to name it as significant. He stopped in front of Catherine. She was looking up at him. Her eyes were full. She was not quite crying, but it was a near thing. He took her hand, and then Arthur Blackwell, Duke of Blackwell, in front of 200 members of the English aristocracy, he went down on one knee, not for show, not for the room. "I am sorry," he said, quietly, just for her. "For every week I spent doubting you. You deserved better from me." Catherine's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, just a single tear and the kind of exhale that comes from putting down something very heavy. She squeezed his hand. "Get up, Arthur," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "People are staring." "Let them," he said. He stood. He turned to face the room. His eyes found Edward, still at the fireplace, his champagne glass now entirely still in his hand. The easy confidence was gone. Something else in its place. The particular expression of a man who has spent years betting on a particular outcome and has just watched it become impossible. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "Edward," he said, pleasantly. "I think it would be best if you arranged to leave tomorrow morning. We can discuss the details of your allowance in due course. Tonight, I'd like you to leave quietly." Edward opened his mouth, closed it, put down his champagne, and left. Arthur turned back to the room. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "Please, enjoy the rest of the evening." He nodded to the orchestra. The music started again. 200 people went home that night and talked about what they had witnessed for weeks afterward. Some of them had the grace to feel ashamed of the conclusions they had drawn. Most of them simply marveled at it, at the extraordinary, unlikely, quietly devastating thing they had seen in that room, a man, in front of everyone, choosing the truth over the performance, and a woman who had spent 3 years carrying an impossible thing alone, finally, putting it down. The house was quiet by 2 a.m. The last carriages had gone. The candles were being extinguished one by one, the great hall returning to shadow. The orchestra had packed their instruments. The flowers would be taken down tomorrow. Arthur and Catherine sat in the garden. The same stone bench, the same east wall, the same old roses, bare now in late October, stripped back to their thorns. Neither of them had suggested it. They had simply both, independently, ended up there, as though the place that had started things between them was the only appropriate place for this. They sat for a while without speaking. The night was cold and clear, the kind of autumn night where the stars are very bright and the world feels very still and very large at the same time. "Are you all right?" Arthur asked. Catherine considered it. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again tomorrow." He almost smiled. "How long has Whitmore known?" "About a year. He met William by chance. A riding accident near the village. William helped him. Whitmore noticed the resemblance." She paused. "He came to me. He didn't have to. He could have said nothing. He's a good man." "He is." A pause. "I owe him an apology," Arthur said quietly. Catherine looked at him. "You owe several people apologies?" "I know. Starting with yourself, possibly." He looked at her. "That," he said, "is a very Catherine thing to say." She almost smiled too. "Tell me about him," Arthur said. And Catherine did. She told him everything. The first time she had seen William, from a distance, across a village green, not knowing yet who he was, and already feeling something she couldn't explain. The way he moved. The particular set of his jaw when he was thinking. The books he liked. The way he had spoken to her, that night in the stable, not knowing she was anything other than a stranger, with a directness and a quiet dignity that had made her chest ache in a way she couldn't fully account for. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "That's not a Blackwell trait," Arthur said. "That's just a human trait. He has it more than most humans." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "When can I meet him?" Catherine turned to look at him. "I thought you might ask that," she said. "I've been thinking about how it should be done." "And?" "Carefully," she said. "He doesn't know who he is. That conversation will change everything for him. It needs to be done right," Arthur said. "Yes. Together." She looked at him. "Together," she agreed. They sat a little longer in the cold. After a while, without discussion, Arthur reached over and took her hand. Catherine looked down at their joined hands, then out at the dark garden. She did not pull away. There is a thing that happens between people who have both, separately, survived a great deal when they finally stop surviving separately. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a declaration or a dramatic moment. It just settles. Like the house settling into its foundations. Like the quiet after a very long storm. April 1886. The Blackwell Estate in Wiltshire. A Sunday morning. Mild and bright, the first real warmth of spring coming through the windows. At the breakfast table, Arthur, Catherine, and a 17-year-old boy with golden hair and his father's jaw, who was currently engaged in a spirited disagreement with Arthur about the management of tenant land. William Hartley, who would, in due course, when he was ready, take another name, had been introduced to the truth of his origins on a December afternoon in Yorkshire, in a quiet sitting room, by a duke and a duchess who had sat across from him and told him everything without evasion and without theater. He had been silent for a very long time afterward. Then he had asked 3 questions, precise, direct questions, the kind that cut straight to what actually mattered. Arthur had recognized the instinct immediately. It had taken William 2 months to agree to come to Wiltshire. Another month before the formality and his bearing loosened enough that he would argue at the breakfast table. This morning he was arguing well. Catherine sat with her coffee and watched them. Arthur was leaning forward, making a point about drainage systems with an intensity that she recognized. That particular quality he had when something genuinely interested him, when he forgot to be reserved and was just himself. William was leaning forward in precisely the same way, making the counter-argument with a stubbornness that Catherine had predicted months ago on a cold bench in an October garden. She had been right about the stubbornness. She had been right about most of it. Upstairs, the locked room was no longer locked. The windows had been opened, as Arthur had said they would be. Eleanor's books had been dusted and shelved in the main library. Her journal, Arthur had read it, finally, over 3 quiet evenings in February, was on the desk in his study, no longer something to be contained, but something to be part of the house. Eleanor had called him Will in the last entry. If it is a boy, I should like to call him Will. It had taken Arthur 2 days to be able to tell Catherine that. She had not said anything. She had simply taken his hand. "You're both wrong," Catherine said from behind her coffee cup. 2 heads turned. The drainage issue on the North Field has nothing to do with the embankment. It's the eastern boundary. I walked it last week. A pause. Arthur looked at William. William looked at Arthur. "She's probably right," William said. "She's always right," Arthur said. "It's her most infuriating quality." Catherine smiled. This is where we leave them, not at the grand moment. Not at the revelation, or the apology, or the knee on the ballroom floor. Here, at a breakfast table in April. 3 people who found their way to each other through loss and silence, and a lock of golden hair pressed between the pages of a Bible. A man who had spent 20 years grieving a child who was alive. A woman who had spent 3 years carrying a truth that wasn't hers to carry. Because sometimes the greatest loyalty is the kind that asks for nothing in return. And a boy who had spent 17 years not knowing who he was. All of them now beginning to find out. Thank you for being here and following the story all the way through. It means a lot to have you with us until the very end. I hope the story stayed with you in some way, wherever you're listening from. Let us know your city and what you thought about the story. We read every comment. We're always working to improve this channel and bring you even better stories. If you'd like to support us and be part of that journey, you can join the channel as a member for a small fee. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.